The monitors hummed like distant crickets in a field that never saw sunrise. His eyelids didn't tremble, they were small doors nailed shut. And still, when she opened the book, the room felt as if someone had cracked a window in a house that had gone stale for months. Night shift had a smell chlorhexidine, exhausted coffee, and the faint copper of Firan. Nurse Clara Mendez had learned to work inside it the way divers learn to breathe slow under pressure. Room 12 had been written off with gentle voices and firm signatures. Prognosis documented, hope managed, the chart a hedge of sentences that said the same thing in more polite ways. Vegetative state, negligible response, no meaningful recovery expected. The doctor had said he'd never wake up, and the team had nodded with the practiced choreography of people who carry mercy like a weight. Then she turned a page and began to read. Clara didn't start with prayers or promises, she started with weather. The way the bay wind nodded itself in January. The way laundry smells when brought into late and catches the smoke of neighbors' dinners. A paragraph from his dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea because it was there, because it had a coffee ring that felt like a thumbprint. Jonah Hale lay unmoving, tracheostomy quieting even the ghosts of syllables, pupils slow to light, a fortress of tubing and transparent masks. But in the valley between his brows there lived a story of a man who had once frowned at crossword puzzles and laughed at his own blank spaces. Clara had read it in the notes from his wife, in the photographs clipped to the whiteboard, in the messy life that kept showing up even when he could not. She read to it as if the words could find a door the nurses and physicians could not. The first night she read aloud, a resident had passed the doorway and lingered, half amused, half aching. He left with a shrug. The second night, Dr. Marcus Reed, a man who measured his kindness in clarity, stepped in, folded his arms, and watched the quiet flatline of a response that never came. He told Clara what he told families because truth is its own kind of respect. This injury was catastrophic, the brain waves grim, the time since insult long enough to have scabbed over any miracle. He didn't forbid her reading, he didn't have to. He issued the sentence by speaking gently, and in that gentleness there was a kind of ending. Clara returned anyway. Outside room 12 the unit spun its little universe, codes called, stretchers wheeled, the clatter of metal trays and the hush afterward. Inside, she read about small things with stubborn tenderness. A recipe for cinnamon bread. A postcard from 2014 with a smear of sunscreen on the corner. A letter his wife once wrote and never mailed because saying, "I'm sorry" out loud had carried more dignity at the time. She read those apologies now. They felt like warm stones placed in cold hands. Sometimes she closed the book and simply narrated the shift, who had a son graduating, who found a hair tie after 3 hours of searching, who had the courage to unsnap a wedding ring before a surgery that might make a stranger of the person they loved. On the third night, the ventilator's rhythm seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a breath. The nurse in her knew it was nothing, settings, coincidence, a quirk of tubing. She charted it as such because you do not put magic into a medical record. But the human in her, the part that refused to be anesthetized by protocols, steadied her voice and read on. She watched his hands, those blunt, beautiful instruments with their half-moons of old all under the nails, and remembered from the wife's stories that Jonah restored radios on the weekends, coaxing music from quiet circuits. It felt obscene that a man who loved coaxing could not be coaxed. It felt like an equation solved wrong by the universe. Clara decided that if coaxing was a language, she would speak it every night. There was a countdown now, the kind that ticked without sound. The family meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Words like futility and withdrawal of care would gather in the conference room and sit heavily on the table, and Dr. Reed, who never lied, would balance what he knew with what he feared and place it gently before them. Clara could feel the decision approaching the unit like weather, barometric pressure dropping, tempers either storming or going eerily calm. She didn't know the right thing. She knew only that endings deserved to be escorted by more than silence. She kept reading. At 3:10, in the blue pocket of night when even the city's stray dogs fall asleep, Clara read the passage about the old fishermen's hands and their stubborn grace. She read it once and then again, slower, as if pacing a prayer. She didn't expect a miracle. She expected to keep a promise to a stranger whose photographs showed a man squinting into salt air, a toddler on his shoulders and a grin he didn't quite trust. What she noticed, what she would never write in the chart and would only whisper to herself later, was a single tear cresting in the corner of his left eye and refusing to fall. She told herself it was lubrication, a reflex, a trick of angles, anything but what it looked like. She read on until the tear dried where it belonged. The days pulled themselves along, heavy as wet rope. Dr. Reed visited daily, not because he expected change but because showing up is its own medicine. He spoke to the wife, Carolyn, whose voice had the brittle lightness of someone walking across ice in spring. They talked about brainstem reflexes, about eat patterns, about the cruelty of waiting rooms and vending machine dinners. They didn't talk about the book on his tray because it felt too tender to touch. Clara watched them become a constellation of people orbiting the same absence, each holding a tiny lantern of purpose because the dark is less frightening when you can see your own hands. On Wednesday night, Carolyn asked to join, her fingers worrying a paper bracelet until it fuzzed. She stood at the bedside, saw the trash, and swallowed against her own breath. Clara handed her the book and the room shifted, something unnameable relocating itself like a bird reassessing a branch. Carolyn read with the careful emphasis of someone translating herself into a language she had forgotten. She read a paragraph about a bar on Elm Street with a jukebox that only played songs if you smacked it twice after paying. She read about the morning they got the call, that his father was gone and how they made eggs anyway because grief doesn't tell you what to do with your hands. When her voice threatened to break, she didn't stop. She laid the fracture flat and read through it. Afterward, in the nurse's station, Clara wrote in the narrative section of the note always the safest place for the things that matter and cannot be measured that the wife had read at bedside. That patient tolerated well, that environment remained calm. She did not say that the room had felt briefly like a porch just after rain. She did not say that she believed the body remembered the door was built by love. She capped her pen and went back to check vitals, to flush lines, to reset an IV pump that was not malicious, only tired. Thursday came like a verdict. The meeting was set for 14 o'clock. Morning rounds were short, the way they are when outcomes have already chosen their shape. Clara arrived early, hair still damp under her clip, and stood at the foot of the bed. She whispered one sentence not meant for charts or supervisors, that if the ending was coming, it should find him listening to something that belonged to him. She opened the book to a page folded at the corner and began to read, voice measured, vowels warmed by a stubborn tenderness. The monitors kept their steady choir. The sun dragged itself up an inch and laid a thin blade of light across the sheet. Somewhere in the building a baby cried for the first time. Somewhere else, a family laughed too loud because even hospitals can't outlaw joy. At 13:42, Dr. Reed stood outside room 12, hand on the door jamb, and watched Clara do the one thing medicine cannot quantify and cannot forbid. He thought of the scan images, ugly snowstorms across dark screens. He thought of statistical curves that always break someone's heart. He thought of the difference between honesty and surrender and how, sometimes, they looked like neighbors from a distance. 12 minutes until the meeting. 12 minutes until words would be required to do what bodies could not. He cleared his throat. He stepped inside. When the meeting began, the air in the conference room carried the same sterile chill as the floors outside. Charts, scans, and lab results formed a wall of logic between grief and mercy. Carolyn sat between her brother and Dr. Reed, her hands hidden beneath the table, knotted together as if in prayer. Clara stood in the back, her badge turned inward on its clip, the quiet witness who always seemed to exist on the border between medical order and human chaos. The doctor spoke with the calm that years had carved into him, phrases like no cortical recovery, minimal brain activity, absence of voluntary movement. Each syllable felt polished, professional, and almost unbearably gentle. And when he paused, silence pressed down like a hand on the room's throat. Carolyn's voice, when it finally rose, was small but unshaking. She asked whether it was possible that hearing could remain, even when everything else was gone. The neurologist looked to Dr. Reed, who nodded. It's unlikely, he said carefully, but not impossible. Some pathways can remain partially functional. It wouldn't mean consciousness, only residual sensory activity. Carolyn nodded, as if this were the language of hope she had been expecting all along. She didn't argue. She simply said she wanted one more night before making any decision. No one objected. No one dared to steal that from her. In hospitals, mercy sometimes takes the form of delay. That night, room 12 seemed to wait differently. The hum of the ventilator, the faint whisper of the 4, even the clock ticked with a strange precision. as if time had chosen to stay and watch. Clara entered quietly, carrying the same book but feeling it heavier than before. Carolyn was already there, a blanket over her lap, her eyes hollow but awake in the half-light. She didn't speak. She only opened the book to where they had left off and began reading. Her voice trembled at first, then grew steady, each word an act of resistance against inevitability. Outside, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and rain. A storm had begun, the kind that makes even concrete buildings feel fragile. Every flash of lightning momentarily illuminated Jonah's face, and for a second, Clara imagined she saw movement, a faint twitch beneath his right eyelid. She looked again, but it was gone, replaced by stillness. She said nothing. She only stepped closer, her hand hovering over his wrist, feeling the weak but rhythmic pulse that had become her measure of faith. Carolyn stopped reading and turned to Clara, her expression heavy with exhaustion. "Do you think he can hear me?" she asked, barely more than a whisper. Clara hesitated, then answered the only way she could. "I think he remembers your voice, even if his body doesn't know how to show it." It wasn't a lie. It was a bridge between science and belief, the kind that nurses cross every day without anyone noticing. Carolyn nodded, her eyes filling with a grief that had begun to look like peace. Hours passed. The book fell closed, her head rested against the side of the bed, and sleep crept in like a kind intruder. Clara dimmed the lights, leaving only the monitors to trace their pale constellations in the dark. She checked vitals one last time, blood pressure low but stable, oxygen steady, pulse quiet. She turned to leave, but then the monitor flickered, a blip so brief it could have been nothing, except it wasn't. The next second, Jonah's finger moved no more than a twitch, a small rebellion in a kingdom of stillness. Clara froze, her hand covered her mouth, as the room filled with the tiniest sound, the kind you'd miss if you didn't want so desperately to hear it. It was a sigh, or something shaped like one, the first exhale of someone remembering that breathing is an option. She whispered his name once, then twice, afraid the sound itself might break whatever fragile bridge had formed. The monitors remained calm. But she saw it, the eyelid flutter, the ghost of a frown returning to a face that had forgotten how to make one. She called for Dr. Reed, her voice trembling but firm. Within seconds, the room filled with the quiet rush of professionals doing what they were trained for, though this time their movements carried disbelief instead of resignation. "Jonah," Reed said sharply, leaning close. "If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Nothing. Then just once the faintest pressure, like the echo of a handshake from far away. The doctor's composure cracked, a breath escaped him that sounded suspiciously like laughter. He met Clara's eyes, and in that silence, both of them knew what the data would later confirm but could never explain. Sometimes recovery doesn't announce itself, it whispers. By morning, the unit was buzzing with the kind of energy that only miracles and crises share. News traveled faster than protocols, nurse to nurse, bed to bed, a current of disbelief carrying warmth into the coldest corners of the ward. The man in room 12 had moved, the man who wouldn't wake up had pressed his doctor's hand. The sentence repeated itself in soft voices and restrained smiles, as if speaking it too loud might jinx it. "Doctor?" Reed stayed longer than usual on rounds, reviewing vitals that suddenly looked less like measurements and more like signals from a returning traveler. The EEG showed irregular bursts, chaotic, but alive. "Noise," one resident muttered. Reed corrected him. "No. It's interference. It means something is happening." Clara didn't go home. She couldn't. She told herself she was only staying to help with observations, but the truth sat quietly beneath that fear of leaving in case the miracle changed its mind. She sat by Jonah's bed again, the book open on her lap though she hadn't turned a page. She studied the lines of his face, trying to memorize the small differences. The skin looked less hollow, the breathing less machine-owned. She found herself whispering not words from the story this time, but fragments of her own details about her brother's first birthday after their mother died, about how silence can be heavier than sound, about the strange comfort in doing something that makes no sense to anyone but you. At 5:47, she saw it again. A shift under the lids, a faint scrunch of effort, as if he were trying to surface through miles of thick water. She stood, leaned close, and called softly, "Jonah, it's Clara. If you can hear me, open your eyes." The lids fluttered, barely there, but enough. her breath caught like a sob disguised as laughter. She pressed the call button, and soon Reed appeared, hair disheveled, shirt half untucked, all the formal distance gone. "Jonah," he said again, firmer this time, "you're in the hospital. You had an accident, but you're safe." The monitors responded first, heart rate climbing, oxygen steady. Then came the impossible. His eyes opened. The light was too much, the world too sharp, and his gaze moved like someone learning to see again. It found Reed first recognition faint but there. Then Carolyn, who had been standing frozen near the wall, her hand covering her mouth, tears falling without restraint. When his eyes finally met hers, something wordless passed between them, a memory neither had permission to keep but both refused to lose. His mouth tried to move, a half-formed syllable, lost beneath the hiss of air from the ventilator. Carolyn stepped closer, trembling, and whispered, "Don't speak, just stay." Reed's orders came fast: neurology consult, imaging, gradual weaning from the ventilator. But even as the room filled with controlled urgency, the air carried something lighter. It wasn't triumph, it was reverence, the kind you feel at the edge of a mystery you'll never quite solve. Clara backed away, giving them space, her heart a drum of disbelief. She had seen bodies fail, had seen machines keep time long after souls had left, but she had never seen this: the body deciding, on its own terms, to return. Hours later, when the noise of medical choreography faded, Jonah slept again, his breathing softer, almost natural. Reed stood by the window, sunlight catching the side of his face, his expression unreadable. "I've spent 20 years trying to make sense of things like this," he said quietly. "Still can't." Clara smiled, weary but luminous. "Maybe it's not for us to make sense of," she replied. "Maybe it's just for us to witness." Reed nodded, the closest thing to faith he'd allowed himself in years. That evening, as Carolyn sat by the bed, her fingers tracing Jonah's, Clara found the book on the table. She opened it to the marked page, the one where she'd first seen the tear. She read aloud, not to wake him, but to keep him company. Her voice filled the room, low and certain, wrapping itself around the steady rhythm of his breath. And though Jonah's eyes were closed again, a single tear escaped, silent and deliberate, tracing the same path as before. In medicine, there are notes, charts, scans, results. But there are also stories, ones written not in ink but in breath and patience, in the stubbornness of love refusing to leave the bedside. Room 12 had both now, the science of survival and the poetry of it. The days that followed felt like watching dawn arrive through fog, slow, uncertain, and yet unstoppable. Jonah's progress was fragile, unpredictable, but undeniably there. Each morning, he stayed awake a little longer. Each evening, his eyes followed the sound of familiar voices. The doctors called it gradual neurological responsiveness, a phrase that sounded sterile enough to contain their disbelief. But to Carolyn and Clara, it was something else entirely, the resurrection of a life thought buried under silence. The first time he moved his lips, no sound came out. The second time, a breath shaped itself into something like her name. Caro. It wasn't strong, it wasn't clear, but she understood. Tears fell freely now, not from pain but from the weight of what was returning. She pressed her forehead to his hand and whispered, "I'm here, I never left." The nurses pretended to check monitors to hide their smiles. Reed stood at the doorway, watching the impossible unfold with the quiet awe of a man forced to believe in what he couldn't explain. As days became a week, the readings improved, tiny increments of consciousness, better control, purposeful movement. Rehabilitation orders began to replace the old palliative ones. Jonah's eyes would drift toward the book now, the one that had carried his story back to him. Clara still read every night, her voice the soft metronome that guided his return. Sometimes he blinked in rhythm with her pauses, other times he simply listened, his expression hovering somewhere between exhaustion and wonder. One afternoon, while the sun filtered through the blinds in delicate strips, Jonah motioned weakly toward the book. Clara hesitated, then handed it to him. His fingers trembled around it, struggling to turn a single page. It was an ordinary movement, small and awkward, but to those watching, it felt sacred. "You've got plenty of time," Clara said, voice low, almost reverent. He blinked, and she knew he understood. Outside the room, the world moved, as usual, pages signed, codes called, lives lost and saved in equal measure. But within room 12, time had its own rhythm now. The staff began leaving small tokens when they passed: postcards, flowers, scribbled quotes. Someone taped a note to the wall. He heard. It wasn't official, wasn't approved, but no one removed it. Hospitals have rules, but they also have places where hope is quietly smuggled in like contraband. For Dr. Reed, the case became a study in humility. He found himself reviewing the initial scans late at night, staring at the gray voids of brain tissue that had once told him no. He'd read them like scripture once, absolute and final. Now he questioned his own certainty. Medicine had taught him how to measure everything except the will to return. He'd spent years teaching residents to recognize limits. Now he found himself standing on the edge of one, looking down and wondering what he'd missed. Carolyn, meanwhile, learned to live between gratitude and guilt. She replayed every moment of the months before the accident: the argument over the business trip, the unanswered call, the crash. She told Clara one night that reading to him had started as penance, but somewhere along the way, it had become a way to breathe again. Maybe, she said softly, he was waiting for forgiveness to sound like his favorite story. Clara didn't answer. She just reached out and placed her hand over Carolyn's, a silent agreement between two women who had learned that healing doesn't always begin in the body. As the second week ended, Jonah began to stay awake through entire shifts. His eyes followed movement now, his hand found Carolyn's without guidance, and his voice, raspy, hesitant, started to return in broken syllables. The doctors called it progress, the nurses called it grace, and Clara, who had seen enough endings to recognize a rare beginning, just called it a second chance. On the 12th night, she closed the book for the first time and said, "You don't need me to read anymore." Jonah, half smiling, whispered something hoarse and quiet that she barely caught. "Read anyway." And so she did. In the soft light of early morning, Jonah's recovery began to resemble something more than survival. It became memory stitching itself back together, thread by fragile thread. He was awake for longer stretches now, his eyes clearer, his responses more deliberate. Every small act: grasping a cup, recognizing a nurse, whispering a word, was an event that rewrote the boundaries of what anyone thought possible. His voice came back slowly, carved out of air and effort. The first thing he said that everyone understood was not a medical necessity, but a sentence wrapped in gratitude. "You stayed." Carolyn cried when she heard it. She had waited months to hear anything, but this simple confirmation that her presence had mattered was more than medicine could have promised her. She reached for his face, fingers trembling. "Of course I stayed," she whispered. "You would have done the same." Jonah tried to smile, but the movement brought tears instead. Clara stood quietly at the edge of the room, her heart full, the same way it had been on the night she'd first opened that book and refused to stop reading. Rehabilitation began soon after. The speech therapist visited daily, helping Jonah rebuild words as if stacking stones after a flood. The physical therapist coaxed motion back into limbs that had forgotten gravity. Every step, every lifted hand, was painful and beautiful and profoundly human. Reed watched from a distance, offering clinical oversight while hiding the astonishment that still refused to leave his chest. He'd seen recoveries before, but none that began with literature and faith, none that had rewritten his understanding of what irreversible meant. One evening, Reed lingered longer than usual after rounds. The room was empty except for Clara, tidying Jonah's bedside. He leaned against the wall and said, almost to himself, "You changed the trajectory of this case." She looked up, puzzled. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." Reed smiled faintly. "You did something we forget to do. You believed before the evidence told you to." She didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. Some truths sit best in silence. By the end of the third week, Jonah was breathing without assistance. He could sit up, speak in short bursts, and sometimes laugh, though it came out like a cough, fragile and pure. The laughter spread. Nurses lingered during breaks, pretending to check vitals just to hear it. The sound traveled down the corridor, startling even the most cynical of doctors into small smiles. Room 12, someone said, used to be where hope went to die. Now it had become a place where it learned to walk again. One night, Carolyn arrived carrying the same book that had never left his side. She handed it to him, and he turned the pages slowly, tracing the underlined sentences with the tips of his fingers. "You finished it?" he asked. She nodded. Twice, he looked at her, eyes glinting with a humor that had once filled whole rooms. Then read it again. She laughed through her tears, and for a moment, Everything, the tubes, the bruises, the long shadow of fear fell away. Later, when the room was quiet, Clara walked past and caught the faint sound of Carolyn's voice reading into the night. She stopped outside the door, closed her eyes, and listened. The words flowed like a lullaby for both of them. It was the same story, but it sounded different now, less a call for awakening, more a song of return. Down the hallway, Dr. Reed signed his notes, then paused. At the bottom of the page, beneath the list of vitals and neurological updates, he wrote a single line not meant for data but for remembrance. Sometimes, the heart understands what the brain cannot. In a world ruled by evidence, it was the closest thing to a confession he would ever make. Weeks later, the hospital no longer whispered about room 12, it spoke it aloud, like a prayer that had proven itself worthy of belief. Jonah had moved from the ICU to a bright rehabilitation wing where daylight spilled over pale walls and hope no longer felt like trespassing. He could stand now, take a few hesitant steps with assistance, and even joke quiet, slurred humor, but unmistakably his own. The staff treated him like an old friend who had returned from a long journey they'd almost given up tracking. But every movement carried a weight of memory, and every pause held the echo of the nights when his name had been read aloud by a stranger who refused to give up. Carolyn came every day, bringing the book even though he could now hold it himself. They didn't always read anymore. Sometimes they just talked, though the conversations came in slow pieces, like a mosaic built one word at a time. She told him about the world outside, how his workshop still smelled of oil and dust, how the plants he'd abandoned had bloomed on their own. He told her about fragments he couldn't place, flashes of sound, the feeling of rain, the warmth of a voice that wasn't hers but had been there, steady and low, pulling him back through the dark. One afternoon, he asked the question she'd been waiting for but didn't know how to answer. Who read to me? Carolyn blinked, caught between gratitude and the fragile jealousy of someone who had been both witness and outsider to a miracle. A nurse, she said finally. Her name's Clara. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth fighting gravity. I remember her voice, he murmured. It sounded like light underwater. The metaphor made her chest tighten. She smiled anyway, because love, she realized, often comes wrapped in the grace of what we owe to strangers. Later that day, Clara stopped by for what she insisted would be her last visit before transferring to another unit. Jonah was sitting upright, a blanket over his knees, the book resting open on his lap. His eyes lit up when he saw her. You, he said, the word rough, uncertain. She laughed softly, relief breaking through the professional mask. You remember me, he nodded, slow and deliberate. I heard everything. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but I heard you. The air between them grew thick with quiet astonishment. She didn't know whether to cry or bow her head. Carolyn watched from the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a fleeting moment, the three of them shared something wordless, a kind of communion born not from romance or miracle, but from having touched the boundary between life and its echo. Jonah reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took Clara's. You read me home, he said, voice fractured but clear. She shook her head, eyes glassy. No, you just listened hard enough to find your way back. When she left the room that night, Clara paused in the hallway. The hospital lights hummed softly, the way they always did, but something felt different, lighter. She had spent years watching people fade, cataloging goodbyes, learning to fold grief neatly into procedure. But this time, the story had ended not with silence, but with sound. She touched the small book still tucked into her uniform pocket, its pages marked by coffee stains and tears, and thought, for the first time in a long while, that perhaps not every miracle was meant to be understood. Jonah's laughter, faint but real, echoed behind her as she walked away. Clara's transfer came quietly, as all endings in hospitals do. One morning she was there, signing off charts with her slanted handwriting, and by evening her locker stood open, a single pen left behind like a signature that refused to fade. She moved to another ward, to floors up, oncology this time, where the days were longer, the stories shorter, and hope came dressed in fragile disguises. But even there, between the rhythm of infusions and the soft click of four pumps, she found herself thinking about Jonah Hale and the way his story had rewritten her sense of duty. She had learned that healing was not always an act of medicine. Sometimes, it was an act of presence. Downstairs, in the rehab wing, Jonah's progress became something of a quiet legend. He was walking now, slow, uneven steps, but with the stubborn precision of a man determined to reclaim the gravity he had once surrendered. Carolyn was always nearby, her patience now threaded with joy instead of fear. Every day she read aloud, even when he told her he remembered the lines by heart. "Then you can correct me if I get them wrong," she teased. He never did. He just listened, eyes half closed, letting her voice become the background music of his return. On one of his therapy days, Dr. Reed came by unannounced. He didn't say much, just watched Jonah shuffle across the room, his left leg dragging slightly, his hand trembling on the rail. When Jonah reached the end, Reed smiled and said, "You were supposed to be impossible." Jonah grinned back, breathless. "I'm a bad patient, Doc. I don't follow orders." Reed chuckled, a rare, unguarded sound, and clapped his shoulder. "Keep disobeying, then." As he walked away, the words lingered like benediction. Weeks turned into months, discharge papers were signed, follow-up appointments scheduled. On the morning Jonah was released, Carolyn brought him the book one last time. "You should take it," she said. "It's yours again." But he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "It belongs here. It already did its job." She left it on the bedside table, its worn cover facing the window. Later, a new patient would occupy that room, someone else whose family would whisper prayers into the same air, and maybe, if the universe was listening, the story would still be there, waiting to be heard again. That afternoon, as Jonah was wheeled through the sliding glass doors into sunlight, he paused, lifting his face toward the brightness. He blinked, almost startled by the ordinary beauty of it, the scent of rain on pavement, the echo of children laughing somewhere beyond the parking lot. Carolyn leaned close and said softly, "You're home." He smiled, still pale but unmistakably alive. "No," he murmured. "I've been home since the night she started reading." Upstairs, Clara finished her shift in oncology. The halls were quieter here, heavy with endings that came despite every fight. As she walked toward the exit, she passed the family lounge and froze. Someone had left a familiar book on the table, its cover faded, its spine creased in the same place. She reached for it, fingers brushing over the old coffee ring like a relic. On the first page, in neat and even handwriting, someone had written, "For the one who reads when everyone else has stopped believing." Clara smiled through the sting in her eyes and closed the book gently. Outside, evening light spilled through the hospital's glass walls, warm and golden, touching her face like recognition. She stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of distant monitors and footsteps fading into quiet. Then she whispered, to no one in particular. He woke up, and for once, the silence answered. Months passed, and seasons changed around the hospital like gentle tides. The headlines had long moved on. The miracle had folded itself into paperwork, summarized in tidy phrases like unexpected recovery and neurological improvement beyond prognosis. But for those who had been there, who had felt the trembling air in room 12, the story never truly ended. It lived in the way nurses looked at unresponsive patients a little longer before turning away. It lived in the pauses doctors took before saying never. And it lived, most of all, in the quiet hours of the night, when someone chose to speak softly into the silence, believing that somewhere, somehow, the words still reached. Jonah walked again, not perfectly, not without pain but with purpose. His scars were many, but none visible could match the ones carried in memory. Sometimes he woke with fragments of voices in his dreams, the rhythm of sentences that had guided him back, the sound of a woman's breath between words. He and Carolyn tried to rebuild what the accident had interrupted. There were days filled with laughter and others shadowed by the fear of losing what had been regained. Love, they learned, was not about returning to what once was. It was about building something honest from what remained. Clara never saw him again. She didn't need to. But one evening, long after her shift had ended, she received a letter, delivered through the hospital's internal mail. The handwriting was shaky and even. She opened it in the locker room, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above her. "Dear Nurse Clara, I don't remember much from those months, but I remember your voice. It was the first thing that reached me, and I followed it back like a rope through the dark. I don't know why you chose to stay, but you did. You brought me stories when the world had stopped speaking. I wanted you to know I heard every word. Thank you for giving me back my life. Jonah Hale." The paper trembled in her hands. She folded it carefully, slid it into her notebook, and sat there for a long time without moving. In her years of work, She had signed countless discharge forms, delivered good news and unbearable news alike. But this was different. It wasn't a report. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts a page turned, a voice steady in the dark can tilt the balance between despair and return. Later that night, as she walked through the empty corridor, she passed room 12. A new patient lay inside motionless, surrounded by the same mechanical lullaby of beeps and breaths. The sight pulled something deep inside her, something that ached and glowed all at once. She stepped closer, lowered her voice, and said, "Do you like stories?" She didn't wait for an answer, she just began to read. Outside, the city lights flickered like scattered constellations, and in that small hospital room, a human voice once again reached out against the silence. Because sometimes healing isn't a miracle. Sometimes it's just someone refusing to stop speaking into the dark.